There is a moment, just before sleep, when the mind loosens its grip on certainty. Facts soften, questions grow quieter, and the world feels slightly larger than it did a few minutes ago. In that space, ancient ideas tend to return, not loudly, not urgently. They arrive the way tides do, familiar yet unexplained, carrying fragments of memory we never consciously learned. Tonight's continuation is not about belief or disbelief. It is about understanding why certain ideas persist, even when we think we have outgrown them. The comparison did not begin with headlines or algorithms. It began the same way it always does, with recognition. When a new object enters human awareness, especially one that behaves differently than expected, the mind searches backward, not forward. It looks for echoes, patterns, old names that once carried the same uncertainty, and almost instinctively, one name resurfaced again: Planet X. If this kind of quiet investigation feels meaningful to you, you may choose to subscribe, not as a commitment, but as a way of returning later when the questions call again and the night feels long enough to listen. Planet X has never been a single idea. It has been a container, a placeholder for everything we could not immediately explain about the sky. Over time, it accumulated layers of speculation, mathematics, mythology, and fear until its original shape was almost impossible to see. When 3i Atlas entered the conversation, it did not create this comparison. It simply reactivated it. At first glance, the similarities appear obvious. An object approaching from an unexpected direction, a trajectory that does not sit comfortably within familiar planetary planes, a name that feels provisional, technical, almost evasive. These surface traits are more than enough to trigger old associations, especially in a culture already primed by decades of Planet X narratives. But surface similarities are dangerous. They invite conclusions before understanding. They encourage the mind to jump across gaps rather than walk through them slowly. And this is where most discussions immediately lose their grounding. Because the question is not whether 3i Atlas resembles Planet X in silhouette. The question is whether resemblance implies equivalence. To answer that, we must move carefully, not upward into myth just yet, and not downward into dismissal. We need to remain in the narrow space between them, where comparison is allowed, but conclusions are withheld. Only there can we see why this connection feels persuasive, and why it begins to fracture under closer examination. And as we step into that space, one realization becomes unavoidable. The persistence of Planet X is not rooted in astronomy alone. It survives because it satisfies something older, something human, something that has little to do with any single object moving through the dark. That realization carries us forward from the lingering question at the end of the last chapter. If Planet X endures because it satisfies something human, then the first task is to understand why 3i Atlas fits so easily into that expectation. The comparison did not arise from ancient tablets or fringe forums alone. It arose from geometry, from motion, from the quiet discomfort produced when something does not move the way we expect it to. Human astronomy is built on patterns that repeat. Most known objects in our solar system follow paths that align, more or less, with a shared plane. This flatness creates predictability. It allows models to settle, calculations to stabilize, and confidence to grow. When an object appears to violate that order, entering from a steep or unfamiliar angle, it immediately feels foreign, even threatening. Not because it is dangerous, but because it disrupts the mental architecture we rely on to feel oriented in the cosmos. 3i Atlas did exactly that. Its trajectory seemed elongated, its approach angle uncommon, its velocity difficult to reconcile with more familiar bodies. These characteristics alone were enough to awaken dormant comparisons. Planet X, in its modern form, has always been imagined as an interloper, a massive body on a long, looping orbit, something that comes from far beyond the orderly zones, passes through, and then vanishes again into deep time. The resemblance, however, exists primarily at this abstract level. Both ideas occupy the category of the unexpected. Both challenge the assumption that the solar system is a closed, settled environment, and both arrive without warning, at least from the perspective of public awareness. This is why the comparison spreads so easily. It does not require belief in myth. It only requires unease with anomaly. But anomaly alone is not evidence. An unusual path does not imply an ancient destroyer. A strange velocity does not suggest hidden intent. These leaps occur because the human mind prefers narrative coherence over statistical explanation. When faced with unfamiliar mechanics, it reaches instinctively for stories that already exist, stories that feel complete because they have been told many times before. This is where the comparison first begins to strain. Because Planet X, as it is commonly imagined, is defined less by its motion and more by its impact. It is not merely something that passes through. It is something that alters everything else. And to understand where the theory begins to fracture, we must examine whether 3I Atlas carries any trace of that kind of influence, or whether the similarity ends at the level of appearance alone. The idea of impact is where the comparison sharpens and where it begins to fail. Planet X is not remembered in modern imagination or ancient reinterpretation as a passive traveler. It is remembered as a force, a body whose presence reshapes trajectories, disturbs orbits, and leaves signatures that cannot be ignored. Its mythology depends not on arrival, but on consequence. Without consequence, Planet X loses its narrative gravity. This is why mass matters. In celestial mechanics, mass is influence. A sufficiently large object does not need to collide to announce itself. Its gravity speaks first, bending paths, altering periods, introducing measurable irregularities long before proximity becomes dramatic. This is the foundation of how unseen planets have historically been discovered, not through myth, but through mathematics responding to disturbance. Here the comparison encounters its first serious obstacle. If 3I Atlas were comparable to a classical Planet X scenario, its influence would not be subtle. It would be written into the motion of other bodies. Orbits would show tension. Long-term observations would reveal discrepancies that refuse to resolve. Yet no such disturbances have emerged. The surrounding system remains dynamically calm, behaving as expected within current models. This absence is not a dismissal, but a constraint. It narrows the range of what 3I Atlas can plausibly be. An object can be unusual without being massive. It can be fast without being influential, and it can be unfamiliar without being disruptive. These distinctions matter because Planet X is defined almost entirely by disruption. Visibility adds another layer to this breakdown. A massive object moving through the inner regions of a solar system does not hide easily. Even if dark, even if distant, its interactions betray it. It announces itself through gravitational fingerprints long before it becomes visually apparent. The silence surrounding 3I Atlas, in this sense, is not mysterious. It is informative. And yet, despite this, the comparison persists. Not because the evidence supports it, but because the structure of the idea remains intact. Planet X does not survive on proof. It survives on the promise that something unseen could still explain what feels unresolved. To understand why that promise remains compelling, we must step away from physics for a moment and listen instead to memory. Memory is not stored only in archives and equations. It is stored in stories that outlive the conditions that created them. When the language of mechanics fails to satisfy, the mind turns to inheritance. This is where the Planet X idea escapes the gravity of science and enters the quieter orbit of cultural persistence. Not because the data demands it, but because the past seems to whisper that something like this has happened before. Across civilizations separated by oceans and millennia, there are recurring accounts of celestial disturbance. Floods arrive without warning. Skies behave strangely. Time itself seems to reset. These narratives are rarely precise, and they were never meant to be. They are compressed memories, shaped by repetition, not measurement. Over time, they shed specifics and retain only emotional truth. Fear, survival, Renewal. When modern observers encounter an object like 3i Atlas, these inherited fragments activate. The comparison to Planet X is not a scientific conclusion. It is a reflex, a pattern recognition response shaped by centuries of storytelling about skies that change and worlds that do not remain stable forever. In this context, Planet X becomes less a planet and more a symbol, a stand-in for cosmic interruption. This is why ancient flood myths are so often pulled into the discussion. Not because they describe a rogue planet with technical accuracy, but because they encode the experience of catastrophe tied to the heavens. The Sumerians spoke of cycles of destruction and renewal governed by divine order. Later cultures rephrased the same trauma in different languages, attaching it to comets, stars, or the anger of gods. The object was interchangeable. The event was not. The danger emerges when symbol is mistaken for mechanism. When cultural memory is retrofitted with modern terminology, it gains an authority it never claimed for itself. Planet X becomes Nibiru. Nibiru becomes an object with coordinates and schedules, and suddenly, stories meant to preserve meaning are asked to carry precision they were never designed to hold. 3i Atlas enters this landscape as a catalyst, not a cause. It reopens old narratives without fulfilling their requirements. It looks enough like the beginning of a story that many assume they already know the ending. But resemblance to myth does not equate to participation in it. And to understand why the idea refuses to dissolve even when the evidence thins, we must confront what these stories were actually responding to, long before names like Planet X existed. What these stories were responding to was not a single object, but a pattern of vulnerability. Ancient cultures lived beneath skies they could not predict or control. Comets appeared without warning. Eclipses rewrote the day. Seasons failed. When catastrophe followed, the connection between sky and survival became permanent. The heavens were not abstract. They were intimate, immediate, and sometimes lethal. In that context, it made sense to imagine celestial cycles as intentional. Order was comforting, even when it brought destruction. A recurring disruptor was easier to live with than random chaos. Planet X, in its deepest psychological form, represents that preference. It offers rhythm to fear. It promises that catastrophe, if it comes, does so according to a schedule, not whim. This is why the idea adapts so easily to new discoveries. Each unfamiliar object becomes a potential mask for the same underlying expectation. 3i Atlas does not need to match ancient descriptions. It only needs to arrive unexpectedly. The rest is supplied by memory, not observation. But this adaptive quality is also what undermines the theory's reliability. A hypothesis that can absorb any anomaly without changing itself is not being tested. It is being preserved. The Planet X framework rarely asks what would disprove it. Instead, it shifts shape, incorporating each new object as confirmation, while quietly discarding those that pass without incident. This is where serious inquiry draws a boundary. Comparison is useful only when it clarifies. When it begins to obscure differences, it becomes noise. The meaningful question is not whether 3i Atlas could be Planet X in disguise. It is whether the Planet X idea itself is structured in a way that allows for meaningful falsification at all. And yet, even as this logical weakness becomes clear, the idea continues to circulate. Not because it survives scrutiny, but because it satisfies something scrutiny cannot reach. It speaks to a collective intuition that history is not smooth, that progress is not guaranteed, and that the sky has, at times, rewritten the fate of civilizations. As we move forward, the task is not to defend or dismiss Planet X. It is to understand what happens when ancient memory, modern observation, and unresolved fear occupy the same mental space. Only then can we see why objects like 3i Atlas feel larger than they are, and why letting go of certain explanations can feel more unsettling than believing them. That unease marks the threshold between explanation and interpretation. Up to this point, the comparison has relied on motion, mass, and memory. But there is another reason the Planet X idea reasserts itself whenever the sky surprises us. It offers continuity. It suggests that the past and present are not disconnected chapters, but recurring verses of the same long composition. For many, the appeal lies not in destruction, but in inheritance. If ancient cultures reacted to real celestial events, then their stories might carry warnings rather than fantasies. This is where the discussion often pivots toward the idea of patterns rather than objects. Not a single rogue planet, but a recurring category of disruption that humanity has encountered before under different names. Viewed this way, 3I Atlas becomes interesting without becoming apocalyptic. It joins a lineage of unusual visitors that remind us the solar system is not sealed. Interstellar objects, long-period comets, and high-inclination bodies all testify to a dynamic environment shaped by interactions beyond our immediate neighborhood. None of this requires Planet X, but all of it challenges the comforting idea of permanence. This reframing exposes a subtle misunderstanding at the heart of many comparisons. Ancient observers were not cataloging objects. They were recording experiences. Floods, climate shifts, and societal collapse were encoded in symbolic language because that was the available medium. To treat those records as literal astronomical logs is to misunderstand their purpose. They were memory preservation systems, not star charts. When modern theories attempt to reverse engineer a specific planet from these accounts, they risk flattening their meaning. The richness of myth is reduced to coordinates. The lesson of vulnerability is replaced by a search for culprits. In doing so, the past is not honored. It is overwritten. 3I Atlas, then, functions as a mirror. It reflects how we engage with uncertainty. Do we seek understanding through constraints and evidence, or through narratives that promise hidden order? The comparison to Planet X reveals more about our interpretive instincts than about the object itself. As we approach the center of this episode, one truth becomes increasingly clear. The most compelling aspect of the Planet X comparison is not whether it is correct, but why it feels necessary. And that necessity points toward something broader than astronomy, something rooted in how civilizations remember disruption and how they prepare themselves, consciously or not, for the possibility of another reset. The idea of reset is where the discussion quietly deepens. Civilizations do not only record what happened, they record what almost ended them. These memories become structural, shaping laws, rituals, and cosmologies long after the original event has faded. When the sky is implicated in survival, it earns a permanent place in cultural imagination. This is why references to celestial cycles appear so persistently in ancient systems of timekeeping. Calendars were not merely tools for agriculture. They were frameworks for anticipation. They measured not just seasons, but recurrence. The fear was not that catastrophe would happen once, but that it might return. Planet X, in this sense, is a modern expression of an ancient precaution. Yet precaution does not require precision. Ancient cultures did not need to identify a specific object to remain vigilant. They needed only to recognize that stability could be interrupted. Modern reinterpretations often mistake this vigilance for prediction. What was once a philosophy of humility becomes a claim of hidden knowledge. 3I Atlas does not validate these claims, but it does explain their persistence. Each anomaly becomes an opportunity to reassert the idea that history is cyclical, that collapse is part of a larger rhythm. This is emotionally persuasive, especially in periods of social or environmental anxiety. The sky becomes a canvas onto which terrestrial fears are projected. But projection carries risk. When symbolic frameworks are mistaken for literal threats, attention drifts away from measurable realities. The absence of gravitational disturbance, the limits of visibility, and the constraints of mass are not inconveniences. They are the very tools that protect understanding from drifting into narrative comfort. This is where the comparison finally reaches its breaking point. 3II atlas can be unusual without being ominous. It can be historically interesting without being historically responsible. The Planet X hypothesis demands a level of influence that simply does not appear. What remains is not evidence of a hidden destroyer, but evidence of a human tendency to search the sky for explanations when uncertainty grows below. And yet, dismissing the comparison entirely would miss its most valuable insight. It reveals that ancient cultures may not have been reacting to a single object, but to a recurring vulnerability, a recognition that the world is not as insulated as it appears. To explore that possibility fully, we must now turn toward the texts themselves and ask what they actually say, when read without the expectations we have inherited. That turn toward the texts brings this chapter to a natural pause, not an ending, but a narrowing of focus. Up to now, the comparison between 3I Atlas and Planet X has served as a lens. It has allowed us to examine how modern observation collides with ancient memory, and where that collision produces clarity rather than confusion. What emerges is not a hidden planet, but a pattern of interpretation. Unusual objects provoke ancient names. Ancient names carry emotional weight, and that weight can bend perception, pulling speculation ahead of evidence. The comparison feels compelling because it operates in a space where proof is not required to feel meaningful. 3I Atlas, when stripped of inherited narrative, becomes what it most likely is: a visitor whose path reminds us that our solar system is open, not isolated. It does not announce apocalypse, it announces complexity. The cosmos is not finished revealing its dynamics, and occasional surprises are part of that process. Planet X, by contrast, remains a conceptual artifact. Its modern form is less an astronomical proposal and more a synthesis of unresolved questions, cultural memory, and the human need for cyclical explanation. This does not make it foolish, it makes it human. But humanity's attachment to an idea does not grant that idea physical mass or gravitational reach. This is why the comparison ultimately breaks down, not because ancient cultures were wrong, and not because modern observers are naive, but because the two are answering different questions. One asks how the universe behaves, the other asks how people survive uncertainty. In the next chapter, the focus will shift fully into the ancient sources themselves, not as evidence for modern theories, but as voices from their own time. We will examine what the texts actually describe, what has been added much later, and how reinterpretation reshapes memory. Only then can we begin to understand whether the echoes we hear in the sky are warnings from the past or reflections of our own present concerns. That distinction between voices and echoes becomes essential as we move forward. Ancient texts do not speak in our language, nor do they answer the questions we tend to ask them. They emerged from worlds where the sky was experienced differently, where time was measured by recurrence rather than progress, and where survival depended on reading signs, not proving mechanisms. When later generations approach these sources searching for Planet X, they often bring assumptions the texts never contained. Names like Nibiru are treated as fixed objects, when in their original context, they were fluid symbols. Terms shifted meaning depending on era, scribe, and cosmological framework. What was once a crossing point, a transition, or a marker in the sky became, centuries later, a literal planet in popular imagination. This matters because reinterpretation changes function. A symbol designed to orient human behavior becomes a claim about physical reality. The ancient writers were not mapping orbital mechanics. They were encoding order. Their concern was not what moved where, but what movement meant for balance, kingship, and continuity. This is why floods appear so prominently, not as technical records of hydrological events, but as expressions of collapse and renewal. Water erases borders, histories, and hierarchies. It resets the social world. When such events coincided with strange skies or rare celestial phenomena, memory fused them together. The sky became part of the explanation because it framed the event as cosmic, not random. Seen through this lens, the modern urge to locate a single astronomical cause feels misplaced. Ancient cultures were not isolating variables. They were preserving coherence in the aftermath of trauma. Their stories endure because they succeeded at that task, not because they predicted future objects. 3i Atlas, then, does not unlock these texts. It simply reminds us how easily we project our questions onto them. The danger is not that we misidentify a planet. It is that we mishear the past. And to continue this inquiry honestly, we must learn to listen without insisting that ancient voices confirm modern fears. Listening without insistence requires restraint, and restraint is rare when mystery invites resolution. This is where many modern interpretations quietly overstep. They move from what texts suggest to what they are presumed to conceal. Silence becomes evidence, ambiguity becomes intention. The absence of clarity is treated not as limitation, but as proof of secrecy. Ancient cosmologies did not hide information in the modern sense. They revealed meaning through layered symbolism, because that was the shared language of the time. To read them as encrypted technical documents is to misjudge both their purpose and their audience. A scribe did not write for distant centuries. He wrote for continuity within his own. When Nibiru is mentioned, it is most often in relation to crossing, alignment, or transition. It marks movement within a system, not invasion from beyond it. Only much later does the idea harden into a wandering planet with catastrophic intent. This transformation says more about modern narrative hunger than about ancient observation. The comparison with 3i Atlas becomes problematic here because it encourages a literalism that the sources themselves resist. The ancient world did not require an external destroyer to explain collapse. Floods, famine, and societal failure were understood as part of a moral and cosmic order. The sky participated symbolically, not mechanically. Yet even as we recognize this, the emotional pull remains. There is comfort in believing that collapse comes from above rather than within. That history resets because of cosmic inevitability rather than human limitation. Planet X offers that comfort. It absolves, even as it terrifies. 3i Atlas disrupts this comfort in a quiet way. It is strange enough to provoke memory, but ordinary enough to resist mythic elevation. It passes through discourse without leaving the scars required to sustain the old narrative. In doing so, it exposes the distance between what we fear and what we can measure. As this episode continues to unfold, the focus will shift from objects to interpretation itself, because the true fault line does not run between science and myth. It runs between curiosity and certainty, and only one of those allows the past to remain complex rather than convenient. That fault line becomes clearer when we examine how certainty is manufactured. It rarely arrives fully formed. It accumulates through repetition, reinforcement, and selective attention. Over time, familiar explanations begin to feel inevitable, even when their foundations are thin. The Planet X narrative followed this path, growing stronger not through evidence, but through endurance. Each generation inherits fragments of the idea and reshapes them according to its anxieties. In the 20th century, Planet X was framed through astronomy and Cold War uncertainty. Later, it absorbed fears of environmental collapse, technological acceleration, and loss of control. The object remained undefined, which allowed it to remain relevant. This adaptability is precisely what distinguishes it from legitimate astronomical hypotheses. Scientific ideas become more constrained over time. They gain precision as data accumulates. Planet X, in its popular form, does the opposite. It expands. It absorbs contradictions rather than resolving them. It survives by remaining just beyond disproof. 3i Atlas does not fit comfortably into this structure. Its properties, however unusual, place limits on interpretation. Its mass, trajectory, and detectability restrict what it can plausibly cause. These constraints do not diminish its interest. They preserve its meaning. They keep it anchored to reality rather than narrative need. This anchoring is what makes the comparison feel unsatisfying to some. Without catastrophic implication, the object feels incomplete. It does not fulfill the expectation of revelation that Planet X promises. And so, for those invested in the larger story, the comparison must be extended, embellished, or resisted. But resisting that impulse is essential if understanding is the goal. The universe does not arrange itself around human symbolism. It reveals itself slowly through patterns that often lack drama. When we impose expectation too quickly, we risk missing the subtler lessons anomalies offer. As this chapter moves toward its closing phase, one conclusion begins to settle. The persistence of Planet X is not a failure of science, but a testament to how humans process uncertainty. And 3i Atlas, rather than confirming an ancient destroyer, invites us to reconsider how we interpret surprise itself. That reconsideration brings a sense of quiet resolution, not because every question has been answered, but because the shape of the inquiry has changed. The comparison between 3i Atlas and Planet X no longer feels like a mystery to be solved. It feels like a mirror held up to our habits of interpretation. What initially appeared to be a question about a hidden planet reveals itself as a question about continuity, about how ancient memory survives by adapting, and how modern thought sometimes confuses endurance with accuracy. Planet X endures because it fulfills a psychological role. 3i Atlas matters because it reminds us that the cosmos still holds unfamiliar forms, even without fulfilling ancient fears. This distinction is critical. It allows respect without conflation. Ancient cultures are not dismissed as ignorant, nor are modern observers portrayed as gullible. Both are responding to the same underlying reality. The sky changes. Stability is temporary, and meaning must be rebuilt after disruption. When stripped of expectation, 3i Atlas stands as evidence of openness rather than threat. It tells us that our solar system is connected to a wider environment, shaped by encounters that do not announce themselves in advance. This awareness does not demand myth. It demands humility. Planet X, by contrast, becomes a cautionary tale, not about hidden worlds, but about how easily unresolved memory can harden into certainty. When symbols are treated as mechanisms, the past is simplified, and the present becomes anxious. As this episode draws toward its final reflection, the essential insight emerges. What makes the comparison fascinating is not whether Planet X exists. It is the possibility that ancient cultures were reacting to a real pattern, not a specific object. A pattern of disruption, survival, and renewal that does not require a single name. In the next chapter, we will return to the texts most often cited in this discussion and listen to them without modern filters. Not to confirm belief and not to dismantle it, but to hear what remains when interpretation steps aside. That return to the texts will require patience, because what remains when interpretation steps aside is often quieter than expected. There are no warnings carved in stone about rogue planets returning on schedule. There are no precise diagrams of cosmic intruders. What exists instead is a language of balance, disruption, and restoration, woven into myth, because myth was the vessel capable of carrying such weight across generations. This is where modern frustration often begins. Listeners want confirmation or denial. They want the past to speak clearly into the present, preferably with authority. But ancient records rarely cooperate with that desire. They resist being pinned down because they were never meant to settle debates. They were meant to preserve orientation in an uncertain world. The repeated association between sky events and terrestrial collapse does not imply causation in the modern sense. It implies meaning. When societies fell, the sky was remembered because it framed the event as part of a larger order. Catastrophe felt less arbitrary when it could be placed within a cosmic narrative. That framing was survival technology, not scientific error. Seen this way, the Planet X concept appears less as a lost truth and more as a modern attempt to recover that same sense of order. It seeks to reintroduce inevitability into a world that feels increasingly unstable. 3i Atlas, arriving without consequence, disrupts that effort. It offers anomaly without apocalypse, motion without message. This creates discomfort because it leaves us with complexity rather than closure. The universe does not explain itself in ways that align with inherited fear. It simply continues, indifferent to expectation. The comparison breaks down not because one side is foolish, but because the needs they serve are different. As we continue, the focus will shift even further away from objects and toward cycles, not cycles of planets, but cycles of interpretation, how each era reshapes the sky according to what it most needs to understand about itself. Those cycles of interpretation are subtle, but they leave recognizable traces. Each period of uncertainty produces its own celestial language. In times of expansion, the sky is mapped and measured, treated as territory to be known. In times of anxiety, it becomes symbolic again, charged with warning and expectation. The same stars are present in both moments. What changes is the way they are read. Planet X emerged most strongly during moments when confidence in permanence began to erode. It was not born in ancient Sumer, nor in modern observatories, but in the space between them, where fragments of myth met the limits of prediction. Its power lies not in what it describes, but in when it resurfaces. 3I Atlas arrived during a similar moment, not because it carried danger, but because it arrived when attention was already tuned toward disruption. Climate instability, technological acceleration, and social fragmentation create a background hum of anticipation. Against that hum, any anomaly feels amplified. This does not mean the comparison is irrational. It means it is contextual. The mind is always searching for coherence, especially when continuity feels fragile. An unexpected object becomes a focal point because it offers the illusion of explanation. If disruption comes from the sky, then meaning can be externalized. But astronomy resists that comfort. It forces scale into the conversation, distances that dwarf human timelines, masses that obey laws indifferent to story. When these scales are applied to 3I Atlas, the narrative weight collapses. What remains is motion, not intention. Understanding this does not diminish the ancient world. It restores it. It allows myths to remain what they were always meant to be, frameworks for meaning, not failed science. And it allows modern observation to remain grounded, without inheriting fears it cannot substantiate. As this chapter continues toward its close, the comparison between Planet X and 3I Atlas resolves into something quieter than revelation. It becomes an example of how easily the human need for pattern can overtake the discipline of patience. And that lesson, perhaps, is the most enduring inheritance of all. That inheritance settles slowly, like sediment after a storm. Once the urgency of comparison fades, what remains is a clearer view of how meaning accumulates around uncertainty. The Planet X narrative was never sustained by a single claim. It was sustained by repetition, by the steady layering of speculation over time until familiarity itself became a form of evidence. 3I Atlas interrupted that layering process. It arrived fully observed, measured, contextualized. Its presence was documented in real time, leaving little room for the gaps where myth usually grows. This transparency is not dramatic, but it is decisive. It shows what happens when anomaly is met with patience rather than projection. And yet, even transparency cannot erase inherited expectation entirely. For some, the lack of catastrophe feels anticlimactic. The sky offered a question, and the answer was restraint. No collapse, no reset. Just another reminder that the universe does not align itself with narrative desire. This anticlimax reveals something important. The longing for Planet X is not about destruction, it is about punctuation, a decisive mark that explains before and after. Ancient myths often provided that punctuation because history itself demanded it. Societies collapsed suddenly. Memory needed a frame strong enough to hold the rupture. Modern life rarely offers such clean breaks, even as it accumulates stress. The result is a quiet hunger for cosmic explanation. 3-Eye Atlas briefly seemed capable of satisfying that hunger, not because of what it was, but because of what it could have been. Understanding this does not require disbelief. It requires awareness. The sky will continue to surprise us, not with fulfillments of ancient dread, but with reminders of scale and motion that resist simple meaning. When we learn to accept that resistance, comparison gives way to comprehension. As this chapter continues, the final task is not to resolve Planet X, but to release it. Not as an error, but as a chapter in how humans have learned to speak with the unknown. Releasing an idea does not mean erasing it. It means allowing it to return to its proper context. Planet X, when held loosely, becomes a story about expectation rather than prediction. It tells us how deeply the past shapes the questions we ask of the present, especially when the sky refuses to behave in familiar ways. In that sense, 3-Eye Atlas served its purpose the moment it entered awareness. It reminded us that the solar system is not a closed museum. Objects arrive, pass through, and depart without ceremony. Most leave no mark beyond a brief disturbance of attention. That disturbance, however, is revealing. What we do with surprise matters. We can meet it with curiosity or with inheritance. Curiosity asks what is observable, measurable, and constrained. Inheritance asks what this resembles in the stories we already know. Both are human responses. Only one leads forward. The Planet X comparison falters because it prioritizes inheritance over observation. It assumes that meaning must already exist, waiting to be rediscovered. But astronomy progresses by accepting that meaning often emerges only after long observation, not before. Ancient cultures understood this in their own way. Their myths evolved as experience accumulated. Stories changed because conditions changed. They did not freeze interpretation in place. That rigidity is a modern addition, not an ancient one. 3-Eye Atlas invites us to recover that flexibility, to allow anomalies to inform rather than confirm, to let uncertainty remain unresolved long enough for understanding to mature. When we do, the sky becomes less threatening and more instructive. As this chapter moves toward its final reflections, one quiet conclusion becomes unavoidable. The most enduring lesson of the Planet X comparison is not about a hidden planet, but about the discipline required to live with an open universe, where not every surprise carries a message meant just for us. Living with an open universe requires a different kind of confidence, not the confidence that everything is known, but the confidence that not knowing is acceptable. This is where many narratives struggle to settle. Uncertainty feels unfinished. It resists closure. And so the mind reaches backward again, searching for inherited structures that promise resolution. Planet X provided that structure for a long time. It offered a way to interpret surprise as recurrence. Nothing truly new, only the return of something old. This framing is deeply reassuring, even when it carries fear. It suggests that history is legible, that catastrophe follows rules, and that meaning precedes experience. 3-Eye Atlas challenges this comfort gently but firmly. It does not align with the expected rhythm. It arrives without fulfilling prophecy and departs without rewriting history. In doing so, it exposes the tension between what we want the universe to be and what it consistently reveals itself to be: vast, dynamic, and indifferent to narrative expectation. This indifference is often mistaken for hostility, but it is neither. It is simply scale. The cosmos operates on timelines and forces that do not map neatly onto human memory. Ancient cultures sensed this gap and filled it with story, not to deceive, but to endure. Modern culture, armed with measurement, sometimes forgets why those stories existed in the first place. When the Planet X idea is pressed too hard against objects like 3-Eye Atlas, something essential is lost. The humility of observation gives way to the urgency of belief. The sky becomes a courtroom rather than a field of study. Evidence is no longer asked to speak. It is asked to confirm. As this episode approaches its final phase, the comparison dissolves into a broader insight. What persists across time is not a rogue planet, but a recurring human response to disruption. We seek patterns because they promise continuity. We fear anomalies because they threaten it. Understanding begins when we allow both impulses to exist without letting either dominate. The sky will continue to surprise us. The question is not whether we will recognize the next anomaly, but whether we will meet it with patience or with the weight of stories that ask too much of it. That patience is difficult to sustain, especially when the unknown feels close. Throughout history, moments of uncertainty have compressed perception. The future feels nearer, heavier, more urgent than it truly is. In those moments, the sky becomes a screen onto which collective anxiety is projected. This is not a failure of reason. It is a survival instinct shaped over millennia. Planet X thrived in those compressed moments. It offered a singular cause for diffuse unease. If disruption was coming, it would come from above, following a pattern older than any one civilization. Responsibility could be shared with the cosmos itself. Meaning would arrive fully formed, even if it arrived violently. 3I Atlas disrupted this expectation by refusing to cooperate with it. Its passage did not compress time. It expanded it. Observation replaced anticipation. Measurement replaced prophecy. Each update reduced the available space for speculation, not by denying mystery, but by defining its boundaries. This is why the comparison ultimately reveals more about us than about the object. When mystery shrinks under scrutiny, discomfort grows. The unknown feels safer when it remains vast and undefined. Precision can feel like loss, even when it is gain. Ancient cultures understood this paradox intuitively. They allowed mystery to remain, but they also accepted that meaning evolved. Myths were retold, not recited verbatim. Interpretation shifted with context. There was no expectation that a story must remain literally true to remain valuable. The modern fixation on Planet X often forgets this flexibility. It freezes interpretation at the moment of greatest fear. It treats narrative as data and data as narrative. In doing so, it burdens new discoveries with old expectations they were never meant to carry. As this chapter continues, the central question no longer concerns whether Planet X exists. It concerns whether we can allow ancient memory and modern observation to coexist without forcing one to validate the other. That balance, once achieved, changes not only how we look at the sky, but how we understand our place beneath it. That balance is fragile, but it is also where understanding deepens. When ancient memory and modern observation are allowed to coexist, neither is diminished. Each occupies its proper domain. The past retains its symbolic power. The present retains its analytical clarity. The mistake occurs only when one is forced to answer questions meant for the other. Planet X became powerful because it collapsed that boundary. It transformed symbolic memory into literal expectation. Over time, the distinction blurred, and what began as metaphor hardened into mechanism. Once that happened, every unfamiliar object in the sky became a potential confirmation. 3I Atlas briefly entered that role not because it fit the theory, but because the theory was waiting for something to fit. This is an important reversal. The comparison was not driven by data-seeking explanation. It was driven by expectation-seeking fulfillment. When examined calmly, the data tells a quieter story. An object with unusual characteristics does not imply hidden mass. An unfamiliar trajectory does not require ancient consequence. The solar system, when viewed across deep time, is not orderly in the way human schedules are orderly. It is dynamic, permeable, and shaped by encounters that do not repeat on demand. Ancient cultures sensed this openness, even if they lacked the language to describe it mathematically. Their stories reflect awareness of vulnerability rather than prediction of specific events. They remind us that survival depended on adaptability, not foreknowledge. Seen this way, Planet X loses its urgency but gains context. It becomes a narrative artifact of transitional moments, resurfacing when continuity feels threatened. 3I Atlas becomes a reminder that anomaly does not require myth to be meaningful. As this episode approaches its closing movement, the comparison that once felt central now feels secondary. What remains is a deeper question about how civilizations remember disruption and how they prepare psychologically and culturally for change that cannot be scheduled or named. That deeper question lingers because it has no final answer, only recurring forms. Each era inherits the memory of instability and reshapes it according to the tools available. For ancient societies, those tools were myth and ritual. For modern ones, they are data and models. Both are attempts to orient the human mind within a universe that does not center it. The comparison between 3i Atlas and Planet X illustrates what happens when these tools overlap without translation. Myth is asked to behave like measurement. Measurement is asked to fulfill myth. In the tension between them, confusion thrives, not because either approach is flawed, but because their purposes differ. 3i Atlas offered an opportunity to observe this tension in real time. As information accumulated, the space for catastrophic interpretation narrowed, yet the narrative did not vanish. It adapted. This adaptability is not evidence of truth. It is evidence of resilience. Certain ideas endure because they are useful containers for uncertainty. Planet X is one such container. It holds fear, expectation, and inherited memory in a single shape. When pressed against modern observation, that shape distorts. It stretches to accommodate what it was never meant to explain. Eventually, the strain becomes visible. What survives that strain is not a planet, but an insight. Ancient cultures may not have been describing a specific object at all. They may have been responding to a pattern of disruption that felt cosmic because it exceeded human control. Floods, climate shifts, and collapse were experienced as total events. The sky became part of the story because it framed those events as meaningful rather than random. This realization does not close the discussion. It redirects it. As we move beyond this chapter, the focus will no longer be on identifying Planet X in modern anomalies. It will be on understanding how ancient texts encode experience and how modern minds decode them through the lens of present uncertainty. In the next phase of this saga, we will slow down even further. We will sit with the words themselves, without projection, without urgency, and without the need for confirmation. Only then can we begin to hear what has been preserved, not as warning, but as memory. That slowing down marks the transition into a different layer of the story. If earlier chapters examined comparison and interpretation, this phase turns toward consequence. Not the imagined consequence of a hidden planet, but the real consequences that shaped ancient memory in the first place. Catastrophe did not need a name to be transformative. It needed only to happen. Across deep time, humanity has endured events that shattered continuity. Floods erased settlements. Droughts collapsed networks of trade and belief. Volcanic winters dimmed skies and shortened growing seasons. To those who lived through such moments, the world did not simply change. It ended and then cautiously began again. These experiences produced a particular kind of memory, not a record of dates and causes, but a compression of fear and survival into narrative form. When ancient texts speak of endings and renewals, they are not speculating about the future. They are stabilizing the past. They are answering the question of how life continued after it should have stopped. This is where modern attempts to identify a single celestial culprit falter. Catastrophe rarely arrives from one direction alone. Environmental stress, seismic upheaval, climate fluctuation, and social fragility often converge. The sky becomes part of the story not because it caused everything, but because it witnessed everything. It framed the event within something larger than human failure. Planet X, when inserted into this context, simplifies too much. It reduces layered trauma into a single external agent. This reduction is tempting because it offers clarity, but clarity achieved through oversimplification comes at the cost of understanding. 3i Atlas, viewed from this deeper temporal perspective, feels almost beside the point. It did not arrive bearing consequence. It arrived bearing reminder. A reminder that the universe remains active, and that stability has always been conditional. Ancient cultures knew this instinctively. Their myths do not predict a coming end. They remember a previous one. As we continue, the focus will shift fully into those remembered endings, not to dramatize them, but to understand how they reshaped consciousness itself. Because before any theory of cosmic reset, there was the lived reality of survival after collapse, and the quiet question of whether such a moment could ever return. That question, whether collapse could return, lingered long after the physical danger had passed. It shaped how ancient societies organized time, authority, and responsibility. When continuity is broken once, it is never fully trusted again. Memory becomes vigilance. Ritual becomes rehearsal. This is why so many ancient systems emphasize cycles rather than progress. Time was not a line moving forward, but a wheel that could bring familiar dangers back into view. Renewal was possible, but never guaranteed. Order had to be maintained, or chaos would reassert itself. These were not abstract philosophies. They were lessons learned through loss. Celestial symbolism fit naturally into this worldview. The sky offered repetition without control. Stars returned. Seasons shifted. Eclipses reminded observers that even reliable lights could vanish. When catastrophe aligned with unusual celestial signs, the association hardened. Memory fused sky and survival into a single narrative thread. Modern reinterpretations often mistake this fusion for prediction. They search ancient texts for schedules and warnings, assuming that if catastrophe was remembered, it must also have been foreseen. But ancient memory was not about anticipation. It was about meaning. It explained why disaster did not invalidate existence and why rebuilding was still possible. In this context, the persistence of Planet X appears less as a scientific hypothesis and more as a modern echo of ancient vigilance. It expresses the same underlying concern, that stability is temporary, that order can be lost. The difference is that ancient cultures framed this awareness through humility, while modern narratives often frame it through certainty. 3i Atlas, again, does not fulfill this expectation. It does not arrive as a rehearsal of disaster. It arrives as a reminder that not every sign demands interpretation beyond itself. The sky does not always speak in omens. Sometimes it simply moves. As we move deeper into this phase, the emphasis will shift away from celestial objects altogether. The true inheritance of ancient catastrophe lies not in the sky, but in how human societies reorganized consciousness afterward. To understand that, we must examine the myths not as warnings, but as maps of recovery. Maps of recovery rarely resemble maps of terrain. They do not show routes or distances. They show relationships between chaos and order, between memory and forgetting, between the world that was lost and the one that must be built again. Ancient myths functioned in this way, guiding societies through the psychological aftermath of collapse. When floods recede in story, what follows is not celebration, but re-establishment. Kingship is renewed, laws are reaffirmed, boundaries are redrawn. These narrative steps mirror the real work required after catastrophe. Survival is not enough. Meaning must be restored, or society fragments further. This is why divine figures appear so prominently in these accounts. They are not merely supernatural beings. They represent continuity beyond individual lifespans. They anchor order in something that outlasts disaster. The sky becomes their domain because it offers permanence when the ground does not. Modern fascination with Planet X often isolates the moment of destruction and ignores what comes after. It focuses on the event rather than the recovery. This focus distorts ancient intention. The stories were not preserved to warn of annihilation, but to demonstrate endurance. 3i Atlas has no place in this recovery narrative. It does not carry the weight of renewal. It does not explain survival. This absence reveals why the comparison ultimately feels hollow. Planet X promises ending without offering continuation. Ancient myths always did both. Understanding this difference reframes the discussion. The persistence of catastrophic imagery is not evidence of unresolved prophecy. It is evidence of resolved trauma. The stories remain because they worked. They helped societies move forward without forgetting what they had lost. As this chapter unfolds, the emphasis shifts from what ancient cultures feared to what they learned. Catastrophe was not the final lesson. Adaptation was. And that lesson, encoded in myth, still speaks, even when modern interpretations listen for the wrong message. That lesson of adaptation is easy to overlook because it lacks spectacle. It does not announce itself with fire from the sky or planets out of place. It unfolds slowly through changes in behavior, belief, and social structure. Ancient myths preserved these changes not as instructions, but as atmosphere. They taught by immersion rather than explanation. After catastrophe, societies did not wait for the sky to save them again. They reorganized how power was distributed, how resources were managed, and how memory was transmitted. Flood stories, for example, often emphasize who was chosen to survive, not why destruction occurred. Selection mattered more than cause. It reinforced values that were meant to persist into the rebuilt world. This emphasis rarely survives modern reinterpretation. When ancient texts are filtered through the Planet X lens, attention collapses back onto destruction. The aftermath fades into background noise. Recovery becomes an afterthought, even though it was the central concern of those who preserved the stories. 3i Atlas exposes this imbalance by refusing to participate in it. There is no aftermath to analyze, no moral order to reassert. The object passes and life continues unchanged. For those seeking inherited drama, this feels unsatisfying. For those listening closely to ancient patterns, it is revealing. It suggests that ancient cultures were not obsessed with celestial triggers. They were obsessed with resilience. The sky was a participant in their stories because it was uncontrollable, not because it was always decisive. Catastrophe could come from many directions. What mattered was readiness to rebuild. This perspective dissolves much of the urgency surrounding Planet X comparisons. If ancient myths are maps of recovery, then modern anxiety about identifying the next cosmic disruptor misses the point. The lesson was never about prediction. It was about preparation of a different kind, psychological, social, and moral. As we continue toward the later stages of this saga, the focus will move away from objects and toward inheritance. Not what ancient cultures feared might return, but what they ensured would endure if it did. That endurance is the quiet thread running beneath every catastrophic memory. Ancient societies understood that what survived disaster was rarely material. Cities fell, fields vanished, names were forgotten. What endured were patterns of response, ways of reorganizing meaning when familiar structures collapsed. This is why myth outlasts architecture. Stone erodes, story adapts. The narratives that survived did so because they could be retold under new conditions, carrying forward lessons without binding them to a single cause. Planet X, when retrofitted into these stories, disrupts that adaptability. It fixes meaning where flexibility once existed. 3i Atlas, again, sits outside this inheritance. It does not demand reinterpretation of values. It does not challenge social order. It introduces curiosity, not upheaval. In doing so, it highlights how selective modern attention can be. We notice the anomaly, but we project significance that the past did not require. Ancient catastrophes were not remembered to assign blame to the sky. They were remembered to anchor humility. The recognition that human systems are fragile was not paralyzing. It was instructive. It encouraged redundancy, ritual, and reverence for forces beyond control, without insisting those forces had intention. Modern fascination with a returning destroyer often misses this nuance. It seeks certainty where ancient cultures accepted vulnerability. Planet X becomes a way to externalize fragility rather than confront it as a constant condition of existence. As this chapter progresses, the narrative turns inward. The question is no longer what ancient people believed about the sky, but what they understood about themselves. How collapse reshaped identity, authority, and responsibility. Because in the end, the most profound legacy of ancient catastrophe was not fear of the heavens, but an enduring awareness of human limits. And it is within those limits, not beyond them, that the true continuity of civilization has always been preserved. That awareness of limits formed the boundary between survival and arrogance. Ancient cultures that endured, understood, often painfully, that control was temporary. The world could not be mastered, only navigated. This understanding shaped their relationship with knowledge itself. Wisdom was not the accumulation of certainty, but the management of uncertainty. When this mindset is applied to the modern comparison between 3i Atlas and Planet X, the contrast becomes sharper. Planet X represents an urge to name and finalize the unknown, to give disruption a face and a schedule. It promises mastery through identification. Ancient thought moved in the opposite direction. It preserved openness, even in fear. 3i Atlas does not reward the desire for mastery. It resists final meaning. It can be observed, modeled, and contextualized, but it does not resolve deeper anxieties. That refusal frustrates modern expectation, which often equates understanding with closure. Ancient myths rarely offered closure. They ended in continuation. Life resumed under altered conditions, and memory carried forward what could not be rebuilt physically. This is why endings in these stories feel unresolved to modern readers. They were not meant to conclude. They were meant to orient. Planet X narratives, by contrast, often seek finality, an end event, a reset that clears complexity and begins again. This longing says more about modern exhaustion than ancient foresight. It reveals a desire to escape incremental uncertainty through dramatic explanation. Understanding this difference reframes the entire comparison. The question is not whether 3i Atlas fits the Planet X model. It is whether the model itself reflects ancient wisdom or modern impatience. When viewed through the lens of endurance rather than prediction, the answer becomes clearer. As we move further, the focus turns toward how ancient societies transmitted this endurance across generations, not through warnings of return, but through structures that assumed disruption was always possible. In that assumption lies a form of quiet resilience that modern narratives often overlook. That quiet resilience did not announce itself with certainty or prophecy. It lived in repetition, in rituals performed not because catastrophe was imminent, but because it was conceivable. Memory was rehearsed not to predict disaster, but to remain oriented if it arrived. This orientation is often mistaken for fear. In reality, it was preparation without panic. Ancient societies understood that stability was provisional. Their systems were designed to bend rather than break. Myth reinforced this flexibility by embedding disruption into the structure of meaning itself. When Planet X is read back into these systems, it distorts that function. It converts readiness into alarm. It turns humility into anticipation of doom. This shift changes how the past is understood and how the present responds to uncertainty. 3i Atlas, once again, exposes the gap. It arrives without demanding ritual, without altering behavior, without triggering recovery mechanisms. It is observed and then integrated into knowledge. Life continues. The world does not reorganize itself around its passage. This contrast highlights the danger of overinterpretation. Not every anomaly is a rehearsal for collapse. Not every ancient story is a coded warning. Sometimes continuity persists because adaptation has already occurred. The lesson has already been learned. Ancient cultures survived not because they knew what would come, but because they accepted that something would. This acceptance shaped governance, spirituality, and social cohesion. It did not require identification of a specific threat. It required acknowledgement of vulnerability. As this chapter approaches its final movement, the narrative returns to the present with a different posture. The sky remains vast and unpredictable. Objects will continue to surprise us. The question is no longer whether one of them carries ancient consequence, but whether we can remember the deeper lesson ancient memory preserved. That survival depends less on foresight and more on flexibility. Flexibility, once recognized, changes the tone of the entire discussion. It replaces urgency with attentiveness. Instead of asking what an object means for the fate of the world, the question becomes what our reaction reveals about our readiness for change. This is where the comparison between 3i Atlas and Planet X finally dissolves into something more instructive than speculative. Planet X demands rigidity. It requires belief in a specific sequence, a specific return, a specific outcome. It narrows interpretation until only confirmation feels acceptable. Ancient cultures did not operate this way. Their myths allowed for variation, reinterpretation, and adaptation. Meaning shifted as conditions shifted. 3i Atlas aligns far more closely with this ancient flexibility than with modern rigidity. It challenges assumptions without demanding allegiance. It reminds us that the cosmos remains active without insisting that activity is directed toward us. This reminder can feel unsettling, but it is also liberating. When the sky is no longer treated as an omen factory, attention returns to what can actually be shaped. Social resilience, memory transmission, the ability to respond rather than predict. Ancient catastrophes did not produce surviving cultures by teaching them what would happen next. They taught them how to endure whatever did. This is why the Planet X idea, though compelling, ultimately breaks down. It asks ancient memory to serve modern anxiety. It extracts fear while discarding the wisdom that fear once supported. In doing so, it misuses the past. As we close this phase of the saga, the comparison that once felt central now feels like a doorway rather than a destination. It led us into a deeper examination of how humans interpret the sky, remember collapse, and carry lessons forward across deep time. What remains is not an answer hidden in the stars, but a question grounded on Earth. How do we live knowing that stability is temporary and meaning must be rebuilt again and again? That question, more than any object passing through the dark, is the true inheritance of ancient catastrophe. That inheritance carries us into the final interpretive phase, where speculation gives way to reflection. By this point, Planet X has faded from its role as a proposed object and re-emerged as a concept shaped by repetition, anxiety, and cultural memory. What matters now is not whether it exists, but why it continues to feel necessary to so many minds. Modern discourse often treats ancient knowledge as either prophetic or primitive. Both views miss the subtlety of what was preserved. Ancient cultures were not predicting distant futures. They were encoding responses to instability. Their myths were not warnings of what would come next, but frameworks for surviving whatever came at all. This is where interpretations involving Nibiru, cosmic cycles, or celestial resets often overreach. They attempt to translate symbolic language into literal schedules. In doing so, they impose a modern hunger for precision onto a past that valued adaptability. The result is a distortion that feels authoritative but rests on fragile ground. 3i Atlas sits at the center of this distortion without belonging to it. It becomes a screen onto which unresolved theories are projected. Its ambiguity invites meaning, but its constraints resist it. This tension reveals the limits of speculative expansion. At some point, interpretation must either anchor itself to evidence or dissolve into myth. Ancient cosmology accepted this boundary. It did not confuse symbol with substance. The sky was meaningful because it was beyond control, not because it carried secret instructions. When later generations attempt to reverse this relationship, the past becomes a tool rather than a teacher. As we move deeper into this phase, the discussion shifts away from celestial mechanics entirely. The real question is no longer what moves through the sky, but what moves through memory. How ideas survive, mutate, and return under new names when societies face uncertainty once again. In this light, Planet X is not a discovery waiting to be confirmed. It is a pattern waiting to be understood, and understanding it requires stepping back from the object and listening instead to the rhythm of recurrence that shapes human thought across eras. That rhythm of recurrence does not belong to the sky alone. It belongs to the way humans process time. When stability holds, the future feels open and expansive. When stability weakens, the future contracts, and the past rushes forward to fill the gap. Old ideas resurface not because they were correct, but because they are familiar. Planet X returns in these moments as a kind of intellectual echo. It carries the weight of earlier anxieties, repackaged for a new context. Each reappearance feels urgent, even if the details change. The object remains elusive, but the emotion remains constant. Something is coming. Something always has. 3i Atlas entered this emotional landscape by coincidence, not intention. Its arrival intersected with a period already shaped by unease, environmental stress, geopolitical uncertainty, and accelerating change created fertile ground for interpretation. Against that backdrop, comparison felt inevitable, but inevitability is not accuracy. When examined without urgency, the comparison loses coherence. The mechanics do not align, the consequences do not follow. What persists is the emotional resonance, not the physical explanation. This distinction is crucial because it separates fear from function. Ancient cultures navigated this separation with care. They allowed fear to inform reverence, not prediction. The sky inspired humility because it could not be controlled, not because it was expected to intervene on schedule. When disaster occurred, it was integrated into memory as part of a larger pattern of vulnerability, not as proof of a single cause. Modern reinterpretations often reverse this logic. They seek the cause first, hoping it will explain the feeling. Planet X offers that promise. It suggests that anxiety has an external origin and that once identified, uncertainty can be contained. 3i Atlas quietly resists this containment. It refuses to carry the emotional weight assigned to it. In doing so, it invites a different response. Not resolution, but recognition. The recognition that some fears persist, not because they are confirmed, but because they are inherited. As we approach the closing movements of this narrative, the emphasis shifts toward that inheritance, not as burden, but as awareness, because to understand why certain ideas return is to gain insight into how civilizations remember and how they prepare themselves, consciously or not, for futures they cannot predict. That preparation rarely takes the form of clear plans. It takes the form of posture, a way of standing in relation to uncertainty that is learned over generations. Ancient myths cultivated this posture subtly. They did not promise safety. They promised continuity of meaning even when safety failed. This is where the modern obsession with verification often misfires. By demanding that ancient narratives function as empirical forecasts, we strip them of the very role they were designed to play. They were not blueprints for survival. They were reminders that survival had already happened, even under conditions worse than those currently imagined. Planet X, when framed as an imminent physical threat, bypasses this inheritance. It collapses posture into panic. It narrows attention toward a single imagined event, rather than broad readiness for many possible disruptions. In this sense, the theory does not extend ancient wisdom. It replaces it. 3i Atlas stands in quiet contrast to this narrowing. It expands awareness without dictating response. It reminds us that the universe remains active beyond our schedules, and that most cosmic events pass without consequence. This reminder can feel unsatisfying to those seeking narrative closure, but it aligns more closely with how ancient cultures actually lived with the unknown. They did not expect the sky to announce itself clearly. They expected ambiguity. Signs were interpreted cautiously, woven into broader systems of meaning rather than isolated as singular causes. The modern desire to extract a definitive answer from every anomaly reflects impatience, not insight. As this saga moves toward its final reflections, the tension between expectation and acceptance becomes the central theme. Not whether Planet X is real, and not whether Three-Eye Atlas resembles it, but whether we are willing to live without forcing the universe to explain itself in familiar terms. In that willingness lies a different kind of preparedness, one rooted not in prediction, but in adaptability, not in certainty, but in memory, that remains flexible enough to guide without constraining. That flexibility of memory is easily underestimated because it does not announce itself as knowledge. It feels more like intuition, a sense of proportion that keeps fear from hardening into doctrine. Ancient cultures cultivated this sense not through answers, but through stories that could be entered again and again, each time yielding something slightly different. Modern reinterpretations often freeze those stories at the moment of greatest tension. They extract the threat and discard the context. Planet X narratives tend to do exactly this. They isolate destruction and amplify it, while ignoring the frameworks of resilience that surrounded it. Three-Eye Atlas refuses to sustain that extraction. It does not escalate. It does not return on cue. It does not fulfill expectation. Instead, it dissolves back into the larger flow of observation. For some, this feels like loss. For others, it is relief. This divergence reveals how differently uncertainty is experienced. Some seek containment. Others seek orientation. Ancient myths leaned toward orientation. They offered a way to remain coherent when the world fractured, without insisting that fracture could be avoided entirely. When modern theories attempt to retrofit those myths into predictive systems, they invert that purpose. The past becomes a warning siren rather than a compass. Fear becomes central again, and adaptability recedes. Understanding this inversion is crucial as we approach the closing act. The comparison between Planet X and Three-Eye Atlas is not merely a question of astronomy, it is a question of how we choose to use memory. Whether we allow it to guide or whether we force it to justify what we already fear. As the narrative slows, the emphasis shifts toward release, letting certain ideas return to their symbolic domain, where they can continue to function without distorting observation. In doing so, we do not lose mystery, we refine it. And in refinement, the sky becomes what it has always been, vast, indifferent, and quietly instructive to those willing to listen without demanding that it speak in human terms. Listening without demand is perhaps the hardest discipline of all. It requires resisting the urge to extract conclusions too quickly, to allow ambiguity to exist without feeling incomplete. Ancient cultures practiced this instinctively because they lived closer to forces they could not control. Their myths did not conquer uncertainty. They coexisted with it. Planet X narratives often struggle with this coexistence. They seek resolution. They want the sky to declare itself, to reveal intention, to confirm suspicion. In doing so, they transform uncertainty into expectation, and expectation into belief. The cycle completes itself without ever touching ground. Three-Eye Atlas interrupts that cycle by remaining stubbornly ordinary in its consequences. It does not announce a turning point. It does not force reinterpretation of history. It arrives, is studied, and is contextualized. This quiet outcome frustrates the desire for cosmic drama, but it also restores proportion. Proportion was central to ancient worldview. The sky was vast. Humanity was small. Catastrophe mattered, but it did not define the universe. Meaning was drawn from relationship, not domination. When disaster struck, it was woven into a larger understanding of balance, rather than isolated as ultimate truth. Modern fascination with a singular cosmic threat often loses this proportion. It elevates one imagined event above the complex interplay of forces that actually shape history. Planet X becomes a shortcut explanation, bypassing the harder work of understanding vulnerability as a constant condition. As this chapter moves toward closure. The comparison that once seemed urgent now feels almost beside the point. What matters is not whether the sky holds a hidden destroyer, but whether we can engage with uncertainty without surrendering to it. In that engagement lies continuity, not the false continuity promised by prediction, but the lived continuity ancient cultures preserved through adaptability, humility, and memory that remained open rather than fixed. That openness is the quiet threshold where ancient wisdom and modern inquiry can finally meet without conflict. When memory remains open, it does not demand confirmation. It offers perspective. It reminds us that uncertainty has always been part of the human condition, and that survival has never depended on knowing exactly what comes next. Planet X, when held too tightly, closes that openness. It transforms memory into mandate. It insists that the past must resolve the present rather than illuminate it. This insistence creates tension where none is required, drawing attention away from the subtler realities ancient cultures work to preserve. 3i Atlas, in contrast, allows openness to remain intact. It does not overwrite inherited stories, nor does it validate them. It exists alongside them, reminding us that the universe continues to produce novelty without consulting expectation. This coexistence is not failure. It is fidelity to how reality actually unfolds. Ancient societies accepted this fidelity instinctively. Their myths did not aim to lock the future into place. They aimed to keep the present intelligible, even when conditions shifted abruptly. The sky was meaningful because it was beyond possession, not because it could be decoded into certainty. Modern reinterpretations often struggle to accept this limit. There is discomfort in allowing meaning to remain incomplete. Yet incompleteness is precisely what allows continuity. Fixed explanations break when conditions change. Flexible understanding endures. As this saga approaches its final reflections, the narrative slows deliberately. The urgency of comparison dissolves into something steadier, a recognition that not every question demands an answer, and not every anomaly demands a story older than itself. What ancient memory offers is not prophecy, but posture, a way of standing beneath an unpredictable sky without surrendering to fear. That posture, more than any hidden object, is what has allowed civilizations to rise again after collapse. That posture becomes clearer only when we slow far enough down to notice what has always endured beneath the noise of history. Civilizations rise and fall, names shift, symbols are reinterpreted, and entire cosmologies dissolve. Yet something remarkably consistent remains. Humanity continues to look upward, not to receive commands, but to remember proportion. The sky has never truly functioned as an instruction manual. It has functioned as a scale reference, a reminder that certainty is fragile and that meaning must be flexible enough to survive disruption. Across millennia, this orientation repeats. When stability is strong, the sky becomes distant, aesthetic, almost decorative. When stability weakens, the sky returns to the center of attention, not because it has changed, but because human vulnerability has become more visible. Ancient cultures recognized this pattern intuitively. They did not confuse celestial observation with control. They understood that looking upward was not about mastery, but about humility. Planet X interrupts this balance by offering the illusion of command over uncertainty. If the unknown can be named, fixed, and scheduled, then anxiety feels manageable. The promise is seductive. A single hidden object, a single recurring cycle, a single explanation that gathers fear into one comprehensible shape. Especially during periods of social, environmental, or psychological strain, this promise feels stabilizing. Complexity collapses into narrative. Diffuse unease gains a focal point. But this form of certainty is structurally weak. It depends on fulfillment. When predicted moments pass without consequence, the belief does not dissolve. It tightens. The explanation retreats further into invisibility. Each failure becomes evidence not of error, but of concealment. Certainty hardens into insistence, and insistence replaces inquiry. 3i Atlas demonstrates a fundamentally different relationship with the unknown. It entered awareness quietly, was observed methodically, and slowly settled into context. Its strangeness did not escalate into crisis. It was constrained, measured, and understood within limits. This process lacked spectacle, but it produced something more durable, perspective. The object did not need to be believed in. It needed only to be observed. This sequence closely mirrors how ancient cultures interacted with unfamiliar phenomena when catastrophe was not immediate. They watched, they waited, they integrated slowly. Meaning was allowed to emerge rather than being forced. Their myths were not countdowns to disaster. They were reservoirs of continuity, holding perspective steady across generations. When modern Planet X narratives extract only fear from this inheritance, something essential is lost. Memory becomes a threat rather than a stabilizer. The past is reduced to warning, stripped of its deeper function. Ancient wisdom is not preserved in this process. It is flattened. As we move toward the closing movements of this chapter, the comparison between 3I Atlas and Planet X fully reverses itself. What once appeared as similarity reveals contrast. One narrative narrows attention and demands fixation. The other expands understanding and tolerates ambiguity. One promises revelation that never arrives. The other quietly reinforces proportion. And within that proportion, something ancient continues to endure. A reminder that survival has never depended on perfect foresight, but on the ability to remain oriented when certainty dissolves. That endurance of orientation, rather than certainty, is one of the most subtle conclusions ancient cultures carried forward through repeated cycles of collapse and renewal. It was never declared as law, never formalized as doctrine, and rarely spoken aloud in explicit terms. Instead, it lived as posture, a deep, internalized way of standing in relation to forces that could not be negotiated with, predicted reliably, or controlled by will. The future was not an enemy to be conquered, nor a destination to be mastered. It was something to meet, often without preparation, yet not without grounding. This posture emerged not from philosophy, but from experience. Ancient societies learned again and again that certainty was fragile. Crops failed despite ritual. Rivers overflowed without warning. Skies darkened, seasons shifted, and entire ways of life vanished within a single generation. What survived these moments was not foresight, but coherence, a shared understanding that meaning did not evaporate simply because structure collapsed. This is why modern interpretations often feel subtly misaligned with ancient intent. Planet X narratives approach uncertainty as an adversary. They assume that fear can be neutralized if its source is identified, named, and localized. Once the unknown is assigned mass, trajectory, and timetable, anxiety feels temporarily contained. The universe seems smaller, more legible, and therefore less threatening. Even when this legibility is built on speculation, it provides psychological relief. Ancient cultures did not pursue this kind of relief. Their relationship with uncertainty was not oppositional. It was accommodative. The sky could change. The earth could fail. Water could erase borders. Memory existed not to prevent catastrophe, but to ensure that collapse did not dissolve meaning itself. Disaster was not understood as a violation of cosmic order. It was understood as an expression of it. When this perspective is forgotten, ancient myths undergo a quiet transformation. Stories that once stabilized consciousness after trauma are reinterpreted as forecasts of future annihilation. Symbol becomes schedule. Memory becomes warning. Planet X emerges in this gap, carrying fear without the stabilizing context that once surrounded it. The past is stripped for threat, while its deeper lesson is left behind. 3I Atlas refuses to inhabit this ominous role. It does not arrive as a herald. It does not demand ritual, obedience, or reinterpretation of social order. It enters awareness, is observed within constraints, and gradually settles into context. Its passage leaves no cultural scar, no moral restructuring, no need for recovery. It offers curiosity without consequence. This refusal is deeply instructive. It exposes how dependent modern anxiety has become on narrative escalation. Without a single external agent to carry dread, uncertainty feels diffuse and uncomfortable. There is nothing to point to, nothing to wait for, nothing to prepare against in a singular sense. Yet this diffusion is precisely the condition ancient societies accepted as normal. Their readiness was not concentrated on one predicted event. It was distributed across culture, ritual, story, and shared memory. Flexibility was built into identity itself. Collapse was possible but not final. Meaning could fracture and still be reassembled. This was not optimism. It was endurance. Planet X, in this light, represents a modern impatience with ambiguity, a desire to compress vulnerability into one comprehensible object. 3i Atlas represents a return to proportion. It reminds us that understanding does not always arrive with resolution, and that the universe does not align itself with human narrative hunger. The endurance of civilization has never depended on identifying the next catastrophe in advance. It has depended on maintaining coherence when disruption arrives without explanation. That truth, carried quietly across millennia, remains intact regardless of what moves through the sky, seen or unseen. That coherence, once preserved, becomes almost invisible to those who inherit it. It does not announce itself as wisdom. It feels ordinary, woven so deeply into cultural instinct that it is rarely questioned. Ancient societies passed this coherence forward not through certainty, but through rhythm, through repeated reminders that life continues after disruption, even when the form of life changes beyond recognition. This is why ancient confidence is often misunderstood as resignation. From a modern perspective, it can appear passive, even fatalistic. But it was neither. It was an active stance rooted in long memory, a recognition that collapse was not hypothetical. It had already occurred. Entire worlds had already ended, and yet consciousness remained. Communities rebuilt. Meaning was reassembled from fragments. Planet X narratives rarely engage with this depth. They linger instead at the edge of catastrophe, treating the moment of destruction as the culmination of the story. In doing so, they echo a modern discomfort with ambiguity and continuation. Endings feel comprehensible. Ongoing transformation does not. A final event is easier to imagine than an altered existence that stretches indefinitely forward. 3i Atlas refuses to satisfy this preference. It does not deliver an ending. It does not inaugurate a beginning. It does not even demand reinterpretation. It simply passes through awareness and recedes. This quiet indifference is often mistaken for meaninglessness, but it carries a profound lesson. Not every event exists to punctuate history. Ancient cultures understood this intuitively. They did not interpret every celestial anomaly as an omen. They watched carefully, compared patterns slowly, and integrated significance only when consequence followed. The sky was not a constant source of messages. It was a reminder of scale, distance, and limits. Most movement above did not require response below. This restraint is difficult for modern narratives to maintain. In a culture shaped by immediacy, significance is expected instantly. Mystery must resolve quickly or escalate dramatically. Planet X thrives within this environment because it offers instant gravity. It assigns ultimate importance without waiting for consequence. 3i Atlas offers none of this. Its lesson emerges only through patience. It demonstrates that the universe can remain active without centering itself around human drama. This realization can feel unsettling, but it is also stabilizing. It returns responsibility to where ancient wisdom placed it, not in the sky, but in how societies respond to change. As we move deeper into the final reflections of this chapter, the narrative releases its last attachment to apocalyptic comparison. The question is no longer whether a hidden object threatens continuity. It is whether continuity itself is flexible enough to survive without needing an external villain. Ancient memory suggests that it is. That meaning does not collapse when certainty disappears. That confidence, real confidence, is not built on prediction, but on the knowledge that adaptation has already happened before and can happen again. When certainty dissolves, what remains is posture, and posture reveals more about a civilization than any prediction ever could. Ancient cultures understood this not as an abstract insight, but as lived reality. They did not expect the future to be kind, orderly, or transparent. They expected it to arrive altered, carrying conditions that would demand response rather than explanation. What mattered was not foreknowledge, but orientation. This is why ancient memory rarely clings to precision. Dates fade, measurements blur, names shift across languages and centuries. What survives is relational knowledge, how to act when the ground gives way, how to recognize continuity when familiar structures disappear, how to rebuild coherence without demanding that the universe justify itself. This was not pessimism. It was realism refined into wisdom. Modern interpretations often struggle with this refinement. They inherit the symbols, but not the patience. Planet X narratives, when treated literally, attempt to convert ancient posture into modern prediction. They replace orientation with fixation. Attention collapses toward a single imagined cause, a single returning object, a single explanation capable of carrying all accumulated fear. In this compression, resilience quietly erodes. 3I Atlas resists this compression by its very nature. It offers no climax, no warning, no narrative fulfillment. It exists within the flow of cosmic motion, reminding us that the universe produces novelty without consultation. Most events do not arrive bearing messages tailored to human anxiety. They arrive because motion continues. This reminder can feel empty to those expecting revelation, but to those attuned to proportion, it is grounding. Ancient cultures lived within this grounding. They knew the sky could change without instruction. They also knew that meaning did not depend on control. It depended on continuity of values, memory, and relationship, even when the external world fractured beyond recognition. When modern narratives elevate Planet X beyond metaphor, they invert this inheritance. The future becomes something that happens to humanity rather than something humanity moves through. Waiting replaces readiness. Anticipation replaces adaptability. The sky becomes a stage for fear rather than a reminder of scale. 3I Atlas quietly restores proportion. It does not demand belief. It demands attention without panic. It teaches that uncertainty is not an interruption of normalcy, but a permanent condition of existence. Ancient societies accepted this condition as foundational. Their myths were not attempts to escape it. They were ways of living within it. As this saga approaches its final movements, the contrast is complete. Planet X stands as a modern attempt to reclaim certainty through mythic literalism. 3I Atlas stands as a reminder that uncertainty has always been present, and that humanity has endured it before without collapsing into expectation. What endures is not an answer hidden in darkness, but a way of standing beneath it without fear overwhelming curiosity. That stance, preserved quietly across millennia, is the truest legacy ancient cultures left behind. That legacy does not ask to be believed, defended, or proven. It asks to be remembered correctly, not as prophecy, but as preparation of consciousness. Ancient myths were never contracts with the future, and they were never meant to function as warnings encoded in advance. They were conversations with uncertainty, repeated across generations until fear softened into familiarity and shock gave way to orientation. This distinction is critical because it explains why modern reinterpretations so often miss the heart of what was preserved. Contemporary narratives tend to privilege urgency. They search for decisive threats, singular causes, and moments that divide history cleanly into before and after. Planet X thrives in this environment because it offers immediacy. It promises that anxiety has a source, that fear has an object, and that uncertainty can be traced to a hidden but identifiable origin. Ancient cultures did not relate to uncertainty this way. They did not expect it to resolve. They expected it to persist. Their myths did not point forward toward a specific catastrophe. They pointed inward, reinforcing the understanding that collapse had already been endured and that continuity was therefore possible. This was not optimism. It was memory refined into confidence. When modern discourse projects Planet X back onto ancient texts, it often reverses this function. Instead of stabilizing meaning, the past becomes a source of looming threat. Stories once meant to reassure are transformed into alarms. Memory becomes dread. The sky becomes an antagonist rather than a reminder of scale. 3i Atlas exposes this reversal with unusual clarity. It arrives at the intersection of ancient memory and modern measurement and chooses neither role. It is neither omen nor myth. It does not validate inherited fear, nor does it dismiss inherited awe. It is simply motion, observed within constraint. And motion, when watched carefully, teaches proportion. Ancient cultures would have recognized this lesson immediately. They did not respond to every unusual sign with upheaval. They observed patiently, compared patterns slowly, and integrated significance only when consequence followed. The sky was not a constant broadcaster of messages. It was a vast context within which human life unfolded. This patience is difficult to recover in a culture shaped by immediacy. Modern attention demands instant meaning. Mystery must either resolve quickly or escalate dramatically. Planet X satisfies this demand by offering instant gravity. It assigns ultimate significance without waiting for evidence or outcome. 3i Atlas offers none of this. Its meaning emerges only through restraint. It demonstrates that the universe can remain active without centering itself around human drama. This realization can feel destabilizing at first because it removes the comfort of cosmic explanation. But it is also deeply grounding. It returns responsibility to where ancient wisdom placed it, not in the sky, but in how societies live with change. As this chapter prepares to close, the comparison that once drove curiosity dissolves completely. What remains is not a question about hidden objects, but an insight into how civilizations relate to uncertainty itself. The future will bring new anomalies, new discoveries, new moments of unease. When they arrive, the question will not be what ancient name we assign them, but whether we remember how to listen without demanding that the universe speak in fear's language. And so this chapter reaches its end not with a revelation, but with a release. The comparison between 3i Atlas and Planet X has fulfilled its purpose, not by confirming an ancient fear or exposing a hidden object, but by guiding us through a deeper boundary, the boundary between myth and mechanics, between memory and measurement, between the need for certainty and the discipline of living without it. What emerges beyond that boundary is quieter than expectation, yet far more enduring. Ancient cultures did not look to the sky for permission to survive. They looked to it as a reminder of scale, of impermanence, of the simple, humbling truth that the world does not revolve around human timelines or anxieties. Their wisdom did not lie in predicting catastrophe, but in outliving it, again and again. 3i Atlas passes through this story almost like a test of attention. It arrives without prophecy, is examined without panic, and departs without consequence. In doing so, it leaves behind a moment of self-recognition, a realization that much of what we project onto the sky originates not from evidence, but from inheritance, from unresolved memory seeking form. Planet X in this light becomes something entirely different from a hidden world waiting to return. It becomes a mirror, a reflection of what societies feel when continuity is questioned and stability no longer feels guaranteed. Its power does not come from mass or gravity, but from resonance. It carries the emotional imprint of ancient disruption into the present, even when the original context has long since dissolved. Ancient myths were never meant to trap consciousness in fear. They were meant to carry it through rupture without losing coherence. They preserved the knowledge that collapse does not erase meaning and that renewal does not require certainty. This was their true function, not warning, but orientation, not prediction, but endurance. Modern narratives often forget this and search the past for confirmation of present anxiety. They look upward for causes when the deeper work lies inward. Three-Eye Atlas quietly disrupts this habit. It offers anomaly without apocalypse, motion without message, presence without demand. It asks us to sit with uncertainty rather than resolve it prematurely. As the night deepens and attention softens, this is where we leave the story. Not with a warning written in the stars, and not with a hidden object waiting beyond sight. We leave it with an inheritance written into human memory itself. The understanding that uncertainty is not new, that worlds have ended before, that consciousness has endured collapse, loss, and renewal across cycles too vast to name. In the next chapter, we will turn fully to the ancient words so often cited in these discussions and listen to them without modern urgency. We will let them speak in their own cadence, stripped of imposed expectation, not to extract prophecy and not to confirm fear, but to hear what was truly preserved across deep time. Not the promise of destruction, but the quiet continuity of awareness, carried forward even when the world changed shape beneath it.